local authorities have been demanding, through people like the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, they've been demanding, I've been covering this the last few days, it's a bit sinister, this. They want people's data, they want their medical data to better effectively trace people, to avoid more localised lockdowns. And in the House of Commons the other day, Matt Hancock effectively told Jonathan Ashworth that local councils are getting that data. They are getting personal identifiable data to help them follow people that have maybe tested positive and been told to stay at home, so that they can follow up on those people. This really is 1984 now, and I don't say that for effect. I don't say it to be dramatic, but I think it's gotten as bad as it's going to get, and then day by day something else happens that isn't challenged, that isn't opposed by any politician really in the country of any note. And I think, where are we going to be next year? Well, we know, of course, that masks will be introduced in shops in the UK, in England, I should say, by next week, by next Friday, tomorrow week. And I fear personally, none of that is going to change until they mass produce a vaccine. And I really believe when that happens, that those of us who don't partake in the vaccine will be told that we will be subject to our own personal lockdown of sorts. In other words, well, that's okay, Mr. Adams, you'll kind of have to hang around your home, or as near to it as best you can. Am I letting my imagination run away with myself, or am I on the right track? What do you think?
Well, I think you are. You're losing it there. No, actually, of course not. Look, this is definitely a part of, I think, a much more sinister and bigger and deeper plan that's been hanging around for many, many years. I would suggest the most important person to look at with regard to understanding how the elite, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, the Gates and his friends and his backers, the oligarchy, have been preparing for a pandemic to shock the world, has been looking at the way that Andrew Wakefield's been treated over the years. I mean, I spent at least 3 years literally puzzling, scratching my head. Why is it? Is it just about the money that Andrew Wakefield is being attacked? He's one of the best people as speakers on vaccines, and he's extremely good. He's not one of these people that says, oh, all vaccines are bad. He will say, well, this vaccine is good. It works. And so let's keep it because it's passed the safety tests. It's been tested properly and it works. But don't then start injecting it into young kids when it hasn't been tested on young kids. Don't inject it with 5 other vaccines into a newborn child. What do you think you're doing? And he's making absolutely clear that this is simply not acceptable. This is effectively using young infants who've got no kind of mental capability to make a decision to take these vaccines, multiple vaccines, as guinea pigs. This is Dr. Mengeler's experimentation chamber in the concentration camp. This really is literally what they're doing with young kids now with these vaccines, because the amount of people who are being harmed by them is enormous. And so many people, I mean, it's just anecdotally speaking to people who say, oh, yes, well, I had this vaccine and actually I caught whatever it was, the flu, say. Even worse, many people have had serious permanent injuries due to various vaccines. I was looking recently at the swine flu vaccine in the 1970s in the US, which was injected into millions of Americans, and it hadn't been tested at all. And then what happens as people start to get together to sue the vaccine manufacturers in the US in the late 70s and early 80s? So the American pharmaceutical industry gets together and gets a new law passed in the States. I think it was 1983 or 4. Which means they don't have to pay any compensation for any damages that are caused by vaccines that they have made and that they have recommended and injected into people. So the government has to take all the liability. So that means, of course, the government and the courts are deciding on whether people get any compensation if their loved ones die after having a vaccine. So, the government very rarely finds itself guilty. And so the pharmaceutical industry has got a free pass. It's completely controlled the regulation of its own products. And so we can't trust anything they do. Yes, if there are proper tests and if there's proper analysis, fine. But Wakefield's attack the attack on Wakefield, Richie, over the years, to me, has crystallised exactly what was going on. They've been preparing for this vaccine pandemic ID 2020 for decades, and this is their big moment. Whether they decided to do it now because of the attempt to ramp up attacks on China and the potential war on China, or whether it's just in order to destabilise Brexit, I have absolutely no idea. But whatever it is, it's definitely a new world order, deep state, oligarchy's decision to do this. And they don't care whether we live or die. The idea that they want us to wear masks, well, that's just in order to coerce us, as I said before, into ultimately taking this vaccine when it comes down the line, as it definitely will.
Make life very difficult for people, and there might come a point when they might beg for the vaccine. I've got Piers Corbyn coming on the programme in about 15 minutes, the physicist and meteorologist. I don't need to tell you who he is. You know who he is. Let me ask you this question. Is it patently obvious now that even if these are not his ideas, is it patently obvious that Bill Gates is the driving force or the front man behind these agendas? Let me very quickly explain why I'm asking you that. Everybody is running a story today to say that rising temperatures in Siberia and the Arctic are proof that man-made climate change is real. The study is done by the World Weather Attribution Initiative. That organisation, I cannot determine whether or not it gets funding from Gates, but I suspect it does. However, its only major partner is the Oxford University Environmental Change Institute. The woman who heads that up, Monica Zurek, used to work for Gates in terms of agriculture, in managing money to be sent for sustainable agricultural products around the world. So there's a direct link between this and Gates. You look at Gates then, vaccines, depopulation. Gates was in the news yesterday talking about depopulation, the necessity to reduce population growth in coming years. Obviously implantables, Gates is all over that as well. Gates is everywhere. So is Gates basically the captain or the rear admiral of this agenda? If it's a ship, if we see the agenda as a big boat, it's not his idea. There might be people above him, but he seems to be in charge on the ground, right?
Well, no, I don't think he's in charge. He's the front man. He's the guy who's going to be the public face of all of this. He comes across as very affable. Hey, everyone, I want to be everyone's friend, you know. The fact of the matter is he's not, is he? He's the one who's got the back doors for the National Security Agency and IBM and everybody else into all of our Windows machines. And that's how he's made his money, just by sneaking into our lives, by stealing our data, by mining our lives and selling them on. That's Mr. Gates for you. And yes, okay, his Windows system is pretty good. I mean, no, but it comes at a price. Bill Gates' price. The people behind him, I would suggest, are more like your Bilderberger characters. So we're talking about the real oligarchy. That is to say, the people with the power and the wealth, mostly the bankers. There's a whole smattering of aristocracy in there, European aristocracy. There's your characters like Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, has a very, very close ties with China as well as the United States. And people like Kissinger need to be examined much more closely, especially when they start threatening that if you don't get this COVID right, there might be a world war. Well, I mean, is that a threat? Or it's couched in terms of language that makes you think it's a warning. But is it actually a threat? Is he saying, look, you better do as we say, otherwise there's going to be a world war, folks? But anyhow, I mean, this is part of the ID 2020 is very, very simple. Have a good old look at that and you'll see exactly what's going on. The idea is to have an identification card that you carry around, a bit like a credit card with an RFID chip in it that blips as you go in and out of a door. And you can only come in if you've got this, which will show that you have been vaccinated or not. Now, what's going to happen? So what will happen is people who've been vaccinated and don't want to will borrow cards or get fraudulently new cards made for people who have had the vaccination. So they will then be able to go around, but then they'll say, oh, gosh, you can't do this. We need to embed these chips in people's bodies because people have been fraudulently walking in, even though they haven't had the vaccine. In which case we start moving into very sinister revelation territory. This is the mark of the beast.
Book of Revelation,
this is the idea that you cannot buy or sell unless you've got this thing in your forehead or in your hand. And I mean, that immediately smacks of sensible stuff from 2000 or so years ago to me, because you've got two classes, haven't you? You've got the head types. These are the people in charge. And then you've got the hand types. These are the kind of worker bees. And that's, I think, the way they're treating us, Richie, really is like a bunch of idiots fed nonsense and lies through the mass media. And we are basically there to be herded around and mind controlled, told what to think. And then we start getting, if you start getting into the book of Revelation itself, you'll see there are several very distinct sections, and it takes you right the way through a period of years, with the arrival of characters like the Antichrist, etc., who will make an attempt to rule the world, a one world order. But ultimately, the good news is they fail. They just can't get it together. They can't convince the world that they're the nice guys. However many people they kill, they just can't do it. And I don't know quite how it's all going to play out, but it's all there. You know, the seven seals, the seven vials, the seven bowls. And, you know, I actually have done a timeline of Revelation. I did it years ago. It must be 15 years ago. I just sat and looked at. And there are lots of little things in there that make you think. Like, for example, it talks about wormwood. Now, wormwood is the Ukrainian for wormwood is Chernobyl. So this suggests that maybe there's a little bit of information in there saying that part of the world is going to be covered with nuclear fallout or some sort of nuclear pollution. And you wouldn't believe that John, the Apostle John, could write that on Patmos, you know, nearly 2,000 years ago, but he did.
Yeah, the more I hear, you've said that to me there, and people have been in touch with me in the last couple of weeks talking about that very thing, the chip and the vaccine and, you know, it being foretold and the coincidences and the similarities. Yeah, I'm not optimistic. We'll finish up on this. I'll give you the final word. I think whatever the agenda, whatever the forces are behind it, I think they've been extraordinarily successful in recent years in distancing people from one another through the many things we've talked about over the years, identity politics, of course, race wars, cultural wars, to the point where even in traditional working class communities where people would have been throughout history would have known the names of their neighbours and would have interacted on a daily basis with their neighbours. I see it now even in Salford. People just don't give a shit, Tony. And that's what makes it all the easier for them to succeed with this. I see this succeeding. I don't believe time is linear anyway. I think we've been through this a million times, and maybe we'll go through it a million times again. We're not going to win this. Whatever they want to do, they're going to do it, because I just see people effectively begging for it, and I see other people just resign to it.
Well, look, I'm going to shine a little bit of light in this conversation.
Go on, son.
I totally disagree with you. Look, what I've seen, for example, we had a demonstration on Sunday in Thornbury, just north of Bristol, which was attended by 100 or so people, even though there was no publicity for it at all. The press never attend. Of course they don't. It was an anti-lockdown protest, and there were a whole load of speakers there talking about everything. It was organised by a young mum in a tower block, not by some sort of civil society organisation. You know, there are people all over the place who are absolutely onto this. You know, people I chat to down the street, or where the other thing is that a lot of people are not prepared to talk about it with strangers. If it's somebody that they know, they trust, they will. I was chatting to someone I'd known for a few years the other day who was saying that he works for KPMG. And he's extremely worried about all this because he knows that he's going to have this vaccine. But he's looking at ways of making it so that he can not have the vaccine and yet have some sort of certificate to say he has had the vaccine. And he's also having to say the complete opposite at work about what he really believes, so that he isn't flagged up as somebody who's going to be an anti-vaxxer. So, you know, it's a very, very complicated issue, and lots of people are not, and particularly the Brits are quite good at this, actually. They're not telling you to your face what they really think about it all. So there's definitely an awareness raising going on, particularly, I'd say, in places like council estates. We found exactly the same with 9/11, by the way, that loads of people living on council estates have seen all this stuff. You know, they've seen this. I would imagine many of them have seen this head of the snake thing, for example, about Ghislaine Maxwell. there are various other things that everything to do with this pandemic. They're seeing lots of their people losing their jobs. They're saying, oh, this is just the Tories up to their usual tricks. So I think, and also if you look at what the Bible says about this, okay, now I realise a lot of your listeners won't think that this is, a good template for what's going to happen and what's happening. But, it's all contested, Richie, right the way down the way. It's definitely not a walkover. You get the Antichrist and the false prophet on one side, on the devil's side, trying to enslave humanity. And then you get the two witnesses on God's side who are constantly out there saying, no, they're talking rubbish, they're talking nonsense and arguing the other case. So, this is the way the Bible talks about it. And it also makes it very clear that there will be a big military contest here. So it's not just about, a discussion in the media. The revolution will not be televised. It's also, a very big battle out there in the world. And ultimately, they lose. Be sure they cannot crush the human spirit. They do everything they possibly can to do it, but my God, they end up landing flat on their face.
I'm not going to answer that, T. I think my audience needed to hear that. They've enough of my miserable, pessimistic predictions. Thanks for coming back on today. Thisweek.org.uk.
What I will do, Richie, sorry, before we finish, is I'll just tweet after the show. I'll tweet a link to my Revelation timeline.
Do you know, Tony, you took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say that. You did that before we met. We met during my days in Spain back around 2009. So I think you put that together before that. And hey, let's make time to discuss that particular subject on its own because there's so much in it. And I know
the sun gets invariably hot. Revelation 16:8. The earth turns completely dark, 16:10. So that's the bit that I think you've been dwelling too much upon.
Yeah, maybe. Listen, mate, Bilderberg.org, thisweek.org.uk. Follow Tony on Twitter. There's only one Tony Gosling on Twitter, so if you look for Tony Gosling, you'll find him. Follow him there. He tweets daily. He's always got interesting things to say. Thanks for your time, my friend. Love having you on.
God bless you, Richie. Cheers.
And mind the ankle. Cheers, T. A bit of a sprained ankle, Tony Gosling, he's dealing with there, and came on to talk to us despite that. 6.5 minutes past the hour. This is the Richie Allen Radio Show for Thursday, July 15th. Is it, or is it the 16th? 16th.